The oil lamp, thick with the stench of spoiled fish and cheap wick, slipped from Silas's grasp before he had even taken 2 steps toward the hearth. It wasn't the suddenness of the tremor that defined the catastrophe. It was the chilling, slow-motion inevitability of it. His fingers, calloused and strong from years spent working the clay and leather, had suddenly decided, yet again, that they were instruments of betrayal. They spasmed, an independent nervous revolt against his will, sending the earthenware vessel shattering against the packed dirt floor. The thick, viscous olive oil spread instantly, absorbing the fine dust of his miserable dwelling and forming a dark, expanding stain, a physical mirror of the spreading stain of worthlessness he felt inside his chest. He stood frozen, the tiny, pitiful flame snuffed out, plunging him into a blackness that was far less frightening than the light, because the light demanded visibility, and visibility demanded accountability for the ruin he had become. It had been 7 years since the accident, 7 years since the small, panicked decision that cost him everything that mattered: his reputation, his livelihood, and the unconditional love of his daughter, whom he could not save because fear had locked his muscles tighter than any iron shackle. The physical shaking, which began subtly months later, had intensified into a profound, disabling ailment, a perpetual reminder hammered home by his own body. He was fundamentally, mechanically flawed. He knew the whispers in the marketplace, the pitying looks of the children, and the tight, judgmental silence of the elders. They spoke of the palsy, but Silas knew the truth. This was not merely illness. This was the physical manifestation of a broken spirit, a soul so ravaged by guilt that it was actively rejecting the mechanisms of life itself. Every healer he had visited, every ancient remedy he had swallowed, every painful ritual of purification he had endured, only confirmed the diagnosis he had made on the night of the tragedy. This was not fixable. You could mend a torn cloak, you could patch a leaky roof, but you could not mend a man whose core belief was that he deserved the crumbling isolation that had become his universe. The darkness settled around him, heavy and absolute, and Silas did not move to fetch a new lamp. Why bother? Darkness suited a man who had become a living monument to his own failure, a man who had already declared bankruptcy on his own existence. He sunk to the floor, listening only to the ragged, shallow intake of his breath, the only sound left in a life silenced by shame, and whispered the phrase that had become his liturgy: "I am a ruin. I cannot be fixed." The shame was an anchor forged in the hottest fires of memory, dropped deep into the seabed of his subconscious, ensuring that no tide, no matter how strong, could ever pull him toward the distant shore of peace. He remembered the specific, sickening crack of the support beam giving way, the dust choking the air, and the paralyzed moment when he had the choice to leap forward, to seize her small hand, or to recoil, and he had recoiled. The physical illness, the relentless tremor that made the simplest act of carrying water or chiseling stone an impossibility, was merely the chain connecting him to that anchor. People spoke of healing, of miracles performed by the new itinerant teacher, the Nazarene from Galilee, but those stories were designed for those who had suffered an injustice, a disease visited upon them by fate or circumstance. Silas believed his plight was different. It was earned. His pain was not an affliction. It was justice. Therefore, any attempt to heal him would be an insult to the moral order of the cosmos. He had seen the crowds surge around the healer, desperate mothers, blind beggars, and the lame, all seeking restoration to a life they deserved. But Silas felt he had forfeited the right to deserve anything but his current purgatory. He had spent years actively cultivating this isolation, believing that the greater the pain he endured, the more he atoned for the speed of his betrayal. He had sold his tools, let his small property fall into disrepair, and allowed the grime of self-neglect to cover him like a second skin. He had become an expert in avoidance, weaving through the alleyways of Capernaum like a phantom, careful to only emerge when the sun was low and the market quiet. He saw Thomas, a former colleague from the tannery, occasionally try to intercept him, his face lined with genuine concern. Thomas, a good, simple man, always brought up the same naive suggestion: "Silas, just stand near him. Just let the light touch you." But Thomas didn't understand. The Nazarene healed wounds. Silas was the wound. The Nazarene forgave sins against God or neighbor. Silas's sin was against himself, a deep, irreparable crack in the foundation of his soul. How could an external force repair an internal decision that had hardened into identity? He recalled the words of the priests, who spoke of ritual cleansing and sacrificial offerings, pathways that were too expensive for a beggar and too external for a man whose fault lay not in his actions, but in his nature. He had tried to pray, once, in the early days, but the words had caught in his throat, tasting like ash. He had concluded that God's mercy was a finite resource, better spent on the truly innocent, and that his greatest act of piety was to remove himself entirely from the account book of the deserving. This decision to remain broken, this fierce devotion to his own damnation, was ironically the only thing that gave him purpose now. It was his shield and his cell. The world outside his hovel continued its frantic, indifferent dance of life. The sound of the grinding stone from the baker's shop carried on the morning air, rhythmic and steady, symbolizing a continuity that felt alien and cruel to Silas. He could hear the sharp, joyous shouts of children playing a game of marbles near the cistern, their laughter a sound that pierced him sharper than any knife. He pictured the dust motes dancing in the sunlight filtering through the gaps in his crumbling roof, golden, ephemeral, and meaningless. That was what he was now, dust. Not the foundational earth, capable of supporting life, but the leftover detritus, swept into a dark corner. His friend Thomas, persistent as ever, managed to corner him one afternoon near the well, offering a piece of freshly baked bread. Silas accepted it reluctantly, forcing himself to keep the hand that accepted the bread steady with the opposite hand clamped around his wrist. The rabbi is teaching today, Silas, in the synagogue courtyard. Not formal, just teaching by the wall. The words, friend, they are not like those of the scribes. They are penetrating. They speak of the kingdom being near, not distant. Near, Silas. Near you. Silas slowly chewed the bread, its flavor almost lost to the bitterness in his mouth. Thomas, the kingdom is for those who can stand straight, who can work the field, who can give tithes. I am bent. I am barren. I am a consumer of resources, not a contributor. If the kingdom is near, it is near in the way a great feast is near a beggar chained outside the gate. I can smell the aroma, but I cannot cross the threshold. He spat the last remnants of the bread onto the dirt. You speak of penetrating words. The scribes have already done that job thoroughly. They have shown me the law, Thomas, and the law demands perfection. Where is the space for the ruin? Does the potter celebrate the jar that shatters in the kiln? No. He sweeps up the shards and starts anew. I am the shard, Thomas. I am only good for the sweeping. Thomas sighed, a deep, frustrated sound of genuine affection bumping up against absolute, self-imposed despair. He doesn't talk about the law, Silas. He talks about the heart. He talks about light entering even the most shuttered room. Silas offered a thin, cynical smile, a ghost of the man he once was. If he spoke of the law, at least I would know where I stood, condemned, but justly so. But this talk of light and heart, that's a different kind of cruelty, Thomas. It's offering a healing I cannot accept because I know, deep down, I am unworthy of the effort. True repair requires a willingness to be repaired, and I have lost that will. I choose the dust. I am the dust. Leave me, Thomas. Go listen to the man who thinks the world can be fixed. I am here to remind him that some things, some people are beyond his reach, and rightly so. Thomas lingered for a moment, his gaze a mixture of sorrow and confusion, before finally turning away, leaving Silas to melt back into the shadows, drawn to the chaos of life only to confirm his exclusion from it. Despite his resolute commitment to self-isolation, a strange, involuntary compulsion began to tug at Silas. The air in Capernaum felt electrified. It was impossible to ignore the sheer volume of people flooding the narrow streets, drawn by the magnetism of the Galilean rabbi. This morning, the crowd was thickest near the synagogue courtyard, spilling out into the open square, a pulsating mass of hope and desperation. Silas, wrapped in his patched cloak, ventured out earlier than usual, driven by a morbid curiosity. He did not seek to join them. He sought to observe their folly. He wanted to watch them pin their entire existence on a man who, he was certain, would eventually fail to address the core problem, the brokenness that came not from disease, but from moral failure. He positioned himself far down an adjacent alleyway, partially obscured by a merchant's stack of empty crates. From this distance, the Nazarene was just a figure, a focal point around which the desperate orbited. Silas watched the faces in the crowd. The frantic intensity, the wide, prayerful eyes, the sheer, unsustainable weight of expectation. He felt a bitter satisfaction in his own cynicism. They will learn soon enough, he thought, that even miracles are subject to conditionality. God heals the righteous, not the self-condemned. Yet, there was something in the low hum of the rabbi's voice, even muffled by distance and the surrounding noise, that snagged at the frayed edges of Silas's composure. The voice possessed a quality Silas hadn't heard in years, authority without accusation. The scribe spoke with thunder, reminding man of his debt. This man spoke with the steady, insistent flow of a hidden spring. Silas strained to hear the words above the noise of the crowd, catching fragmented sentences. "The measure you use will be measured back to you," and "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" These were not stories of political revolution or detailed theological arguments. They were simple statements about internal alignment. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The rabbi wasn't targeting the Romans or the temple hierarchy, or even the common sinners. He was targeting the internal assessor, the merciless judge every person carries within them. This was dangerous ground. If he exposed the self-inflicted wounds, if he dared to challenge the validity of their self-condemnation, then Silas's entire fortress of despair would be undermined. He clutched his cloak tighter, the tremor in his arm flaring momentarily, demanding that he retreat. But the words, now slightly clearer, held him captive, speaking directly to the architecture of his misery, challenging the very dust upon which he stood. The air grew still as the Galilean teacher paused, his presence commanding a silence that seemed unnatural for the midday bustle of Capernaum. Silas, though hidden, felt the scrutiny of the moment, the way the teacher's eyes, though likely not focused on him specifically, seemed to encompass every corner of human misery present. Jesus then shifted the focus of his discourse entirely, moving away from simple parables to a direct challenge against internal cruelty, against the kind of judgment that paralyzes the soul far more effectively than any physical ailment. "Why are you so quick to forgive the thief who stole bread out of hunger?" the rabbi asked, his voice carrying now with astonishing clarity across the courtyard. "Yet you never, not once, forgive the man who looks back at you from the water's reflection. Why do you insist that the world must grant you mercy, when you deny that very mercy to the only soul you truly possess?" The words were a sledgehammer blow against the wall Silas had built. For years, he had framed his suffering as atonement, as a noble, albeit miserable, effort to satisfy a righteous debt. But Jesus was suggesting that this debt was fictitious, manufactured not by God's justice, but by human vanity and lack of imagination. "If I forgive myself," Silas had always reasoned, "then the crime was not serious, and the memory of my daughter's face loses its sharp edge." His unforgiveness was a twisted tribute to the depth of his loss. He kept himself broken to honor the shattered past. Jesus continued, his tone measured, profound, and utterly devoid of condemnation. "There is only one true obstacle to your wholeness, and it is the voice that tells you the wreckage defines the vessel. If you are shattered, who made the determination that the pieces are worthless? Did the potter condemn the clay? Or did you, the flawed vessel, become the judge of your own destiny, declaring yourself beyond repair simply because you feared the effort it would take to accept grace?" This question, cutting through the centuries of legalistic theology and the noise of the desperate crowd, landed squarely on the core tenet of Silas's despair, his belief that he had become unfixable. It wasn't God who rejected him. It was Silas who had preemptively rejected God's capacity to mend something this severely damaged. He had decided that his shame was greater than divine mercy. This was the moment of rupture, The instant where philosophical cynicism collided violently with the simple, devastating truth of unconditional acceptance. If the self-condemnation was the only chain, then who held the key? The answer was terrifyingly simple: he did. This realization shook Silas more violently than any physical tremor ever could. This man, this teacher, had diagnosed the hidden, mortal illness. The arrogance of assuming his own brokenness was too mighty for the Creator. He wanted to run, to bury himself in the absolute darkness of his room. But the thought was now a desperate echo, fading under the light of the rabbi's words. Before the story moves into the climatic encounter, I want to ask you, the viewer, reading this today, what is the defining narrative of brokenness you cling to? What self-imposed sentence are you serving right now? And what price are you paying to maintain the belief that you are the one exception to the universal promise of repair? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes naming the chain is the first step to breaking it. Silas, driven by a raw impulse that overrode 7 years of carefully constructed avoidance, suddenly lurched out of the alleyway. He wasn't walking. He was stumbling, propelled by the need to confront the source of this agonizing truth. His feet dragged, kicking up dust, and the effort caused his entire frame to shake violently. Not just the hands, but his shoulders, his head, a full-body seizure of existential panic. He pushed past startled bystanders, earning sharp curses and confused looks, ignoring them all. He had to reach the teacher, not for healing, but to challenge the premise, to articulate the specific, unique, and overwhelming reason why his mercy could not apply to him. He burst through the periphery of the crowd, the sunlight blinding him after the dark alley, and found himself standing perhaps 15 paces from Jesus. The rabbi had just finished speaking, and the immediate focus of the crowd, moments before intensely fixed on the teacher's mouth, now swung violently onto Silas, this ragged, filthy, visibly shaking wreck of a man who looked less like a supplicant and more like an apparition of judgment itself. The air became instantly charged. Jesus was surrounded by several prominent figures: a few anxious disciples, a cynical scribe watching for heresy, and a wealthy merchant who had apparently been trying to secure a private audience. But in the moment Silas entered the open space, every other figure evaporated for the Galilean. Jesus turned, deliberately and completely, and his gaze fell directly upon Silas. It was not a gaze of pity, nor of shock, nor even clinical observation. It was a gaze of absolute, total recognition. It was the look one gives to something precious that has been misplaced and finally found. It bypassed the filth, the tremors, and the ragged clothing. It went straight past the body and settled on the core of the man that Silas had tried so desperately to kill. Silas felt exposed, not as a sinner, but as a frightened child caught hiding in the dark. The tremor, perhaps sensing the monumental confrontation, intensified, making it difficult for him even to stand upright. He swayed, feeling the shame rise like vomit in his throat. But he stood his ground, determined to voice his final, tragic defense of his unfixable state. The crowd murmured, shifting, eager for the spectacle. But Jesus merely waited, his posture relaxed, his eyes holding Silas's gaze with unwavering stillness. The entire world seemed to contract into the space between these two men, the man who believed in total brokenness and the man who embodied total restoration. All the noise, all the anxiety of the thousands of people gathered, receded to a faint, irrelevant buzz. This was not a public miracle. This was a profoundly intimate court of law, held entirely within Silas's shattered heart. Silas finally found his voice, a raw, grating sound scraped from years of disuse and self-contempt. He didn't fall to his knees and beg for healing. He stood, shaking, and offered his desperate rebuttal to the premise of grace. "Teacher," he choked out, the effort vibrating through his entire body. "They say you heal the sick. They say you cast out demons. But you cannot fix this." He gestured wildly with his right hand, the tremor a violent proof of his claim. "This is not sickness. This is justice. 7 years ago, I chose fear over love. I chose self-preservation over the life of my own child. The shaking is not an affliction placed upon me. It is the physical memory of my failure. It is the natural response of a body that knows it is unworthy to perform any noble task ever again. Do you understand? I am permanently stained. My soul, my very essence, is corrupted by cowardice and neglect. You can command my legs to walk steady, but you cannot command my conscience to forget what I am. If you heal the external symptom, you desecrate the internal truth. I am beyond the scope of repair. I cannot be fixed, because the brokenness is my chosen penance, and to take it away is to tell me my guilt does not matter. The words tumbled out, a confession and a challenge wrapped in a shroud of despair. The crowd watched, stunned by the sheer, naked aggression of his self-condemnation. The scribe nearby shifted, smelling a theological trap. Jesus did not move, did not interrupt, allowing Silas to lay out the full, terrible architecture of his despair. When Silas finally fell silent, panting, spent, expecting either rejection or a complex theological argument designed to chip away at his guilt, Jesus offered the 1-minute secret. A statement so simple, so surgically precise, that it hit Silas not as a piece of wisdom, but as an overwhelming force of nature. Jesus looked deep into the eyes swimming with self-hatred, and he spoke, not to the shaking hands, but to the self-condemning spirit. "Silas," Jesus said, using his name, a name Silas had almost forgotten. "The only thing you have ever lacked is the permission to be less than perfect. Who gave you the right to determine the limits of forgiveness? I tell you this, your shame is the lie you tell yourself when you are afraid of the truth of my sight." He paused, allowing the simple phrase to settle, then delivered the final, devastating blow. "You are already whole. Only your memory insists on your brokenness. Let it go." The physical sensation that followed was not merely the cessation of the tremor. It was the sudden, overwhelming sensation of the weight of the world being lifted from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying until it was gone. The 1-minute secret. "Your shame is the lie you tell yourself when you are afraid of the truth of my sight," resonated through Silas's inner being, vibrating through the years of self-loathing like a tuning fork. It was the simple recognition that the true barrier wasn't God, or the law, or the accident, but his own ego, his desperate need to be the judge and executioner of his own fate. He had proudly worn his brokenness as a badge of his self-appointed righteousness. Jesus wasn't correcting his history, he was correcting his identity. He wasn't demanding complex atonement. He was demanding simple surrender to the fact that he was already seen, already accepted, already whole, regardless of the past. The physical trembling stopped instantly. It didn't taper off. It ceased, leaving a phantom echo in his muscles, like the sound of bells that have just stopped ringing. Silas felt a dizzying emptiness where the relentless internal struggle had been, and it terrified him far more than the pain had. Pain was familiar, peace was alien. He looked down at his hands, which lay flat and still at his sides. They were steady. He flexed them slowly, expecting the familiar nervous revolt, but they obeyed. Yet the physical cure was secondary. The monumental task now was to grapple with the seismic shift in his spirit. He had to accept that his self-judgment was, in fact, an audacious act of self-worship, suggesting that his moral failings were too great for God's solution. He had made himself the exception to grace. Now he was forced to confront the truth. He was merely one more flawed vessel, infinitely loved. The crowd gasped, some falling to their knees, some shouting praise, but Silas heard none of it. He was locked in an internal wrestling match with his oldest, most trusted enemy, his own guilt. To be healed meant giving up the right to punishment, giving up the tragic nobility he had assigned to his suffering. It meant forgiving himself not for the sake of the past, but for the sake of the future. It was the hardest command he had ever faced. He realized, with stunning clarity, that the true miracle wasn't the stopping of the hands shaking, but the stopping of the soul's self-condemnation. The first conscious act of his repaired existence was profoundly simple, yet monumental in its implication. As the immediate chaos around him began to settle, the disciples attempting to quiet the awestruck crowd, the scribe furiously making notes, Silas noticed a small, bronze coin lying near his foot. It must have been dropped in the rush. In his former life, The retrieval of that coin would have been an impossibility. The tremor would have caused him to fumble, perhaps to accidentally scatter dirt over the item, compounding his shame. Now he bent slowly, his spine protesting the unfamiliar movement, and extended his hand. He watched the steady precision of his own fingers as they closed around the cool metal disc. There was no hesitation, no sudden spasm, no internal negotiation with a rebellious nervous system. It was a simple, functional movement. Holding the coin felt like holding a scepter, a tangible symbol of his re-entry into the world of capability. The fix was not an added layer of spiritual power. It was the removal of the false weight that had been crushing his inherent strength. He didn't feel dramatically new. He felt profoundly natural, like a river unblocked. He looked back toward Jesus, who was already turning to address the disciples. The moment of intimate confrontation concluded, as if restoring a broken life was merely a momentary detour in a day's work. Silas realized that the teacher didn't want gratitude. He wanted function. He wanted Silas to stop gazing inward at the wreckage and start gazing outward at the world that needed him. The realization struck him. Wholeness was not about erasing the past, but about refusing to let the past dictate the potential of the future. He still remembered the sound of the beam cracking and the sharp sting of his fear. Those memories would forever be etched into the fabric of his experience. But the memory no longer had the authority to issue him a life sentence. He was still a man who had failed, but he was also a man who had been offered and accepted radical, unconditional grace. The difference was structural. He wasn't a patched-up ruin. He was a newly recognized foundation upon which a new life could be built. He turned and walked away from the crowd, not running in fear, but walking with a steady, deliberate pace. He walked toward the market, toward the sounds of work and trade and ordinary human interaction, the bronze coin warm in his newly steady hand. He had an immense, terrifying, and exhilarating task ahead of him, learning how to live without the defining narrative of his own despair. His journey led him, naturally, back to the dusty alley where he had first seen Thomas earlier that morning. He needed to speak the truth of his experience out loud, to anchor the internal transformation in the external world. He found Thomas near the communal well, filling a leather skin. Thomas saw Silas approach and instinctively braced himself for the usual bitter tirade or the visible shame. But something was immediately different. Not just the cessation of the tremor, which was miraculous enough, but the posture. Silas stood straight. His shoulders, usually hunched inward as if protecting a vital organ, were relaxed and open. When he spoke, his voice was still rough, but the cynicism was gone, replaced by a profound, trembling clarity. "Thomas," Silas began, holding out the bronze coin, "I have been a fool. I told myself I couldn't be fixed because I loved the importance of my own tragedy. I needed my shame to be insurmountable, because if it was solvable, then my suffering was pointless. I wanted the debt to be so large that only my eternal misery could pay it." Thomas stared at the coin, then back at Silas, his eyes wide with cautious hope. "You saw him? He touched you." Silas shook his head. "No touch, only words. He called my shame a lie. He said I was already whole, and only my memory insisted on my brokenness." "Thomas, the miracle was not that my hands stopped shaking, but that the voice inside me that sentenced me to ruin finally fell silent. I spent 7 years believing I was the shattered jar that the potter discarded. I was proud of my brokenness because it proved the severity of my crime. But the truth, Thomas, is that the potter never stopped holding the pieces. It was I who refused to be reassembled." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the Capernaum air that smelled of dust and sea salt and life. "The fix, Thomas, was immediate, but the repair work starts now. I have to learn how to exist without the need for constant self-flagellation. I have to learn that grace is not earned, it is simply accepted. My inner peace is not the absence of guilt, but the acceptance of a verdict passed not by my failure, but by his love." This was the true secret. The instantaneous peace Jesus offered was merely the permission to lay down the weapons of self-warfare, to stop fighting the truth of one's own worth. Silas knew the journey of grief and reconciliation would be long, but the foundation of despair had crumbled in a single minute of profound recognition. He was a new man, not because the past had been erased, but because the future had been utterly liberated from the tyranny of that past. He handed the coin to Thomas. "I must go find my tools," he said. "I have much work to do and much grace to share."